He stood motionless in the doorway, axe still in hand, snow melting off his boots and pooling at his feet. The cabin was filled with silence, but not the kind he once treasured. This silence was heavy, trembling. On the floor lay the letter, crumpled where little Thomas had dropped it, his tiny hand still stained with tears. Outside, the blizzard roared like a beast, but it couldn't drown out the echo of her words still ringing in his mind. "If I don't come back, promise me you'll raise them as your own." The widow had vanished into that storm 2 days ago, and now, she wasn't coming back. Before we jump back in, take a second to introduce yourself and let us know where you're tuning in from. And if stories like this move you the way they move us, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss the next one. The town of Dry Creek was a place where the dust never settled, and neither did the stairs. It was the kind of town that remembered everything, especially the things you wished it would forget. The wind carried more than just sand and grit. It carried stories, half-truths, and the sharp edge of judgment. At the edge of this town, where the chapel's bell could barely be heard and the children were told not to wander, stood a crooked little house that leaned slightly to the left, like it was trying to hide. That house belonged to her, Evelyn Carter. They called her that widow woman, or just her, if they didn't feel like wasting the breath. She came from somewhere else years ago with a husband and a hope for a new start. But hopes don't last long in Dry Creek, and neither did he. The accident was quick, they said. A snapped beam, a crushed chest. He died under the frame of the very home he was building for her. People pitied her, at first. But pity curdles fast under hot sun and small minds, especially when Evelyn didn't cry at the funeral. Not a single tear, just stood there, one hand on her belly, already swelling with the child he'd never meet. Some said she was cursed. Others said she was cold. But the truth was simpler than that. She was broken. Quietly, devastatingly broken. Years passed, and with them came 3 children, Thomas, Lily, and baby May. She raised them alone, with a limp in her step and a long scar down the side of her jaw, visible only when the wind blew her hair just right. No one knew where that scar came from, and no one asked. That's the kind of town Dry Creek was. They didn't ask. They assumed. The scar didn't help. Neither did the way she turned her head too much when someone spoke to her, or the way she missed things, a whisper, a warning, the bell at the general store. Some figured she was going deaf. Others just chalked it up to arrogance. She had no friends, no church seat, no coffee mornings. The mothers kept their distance. The men kept their thoughts to themselves, but not their eyes. They looked at her with hunger and fear. There was always a whisper when she passed. They said she was touched by death. They said her husband's soul never left the house. They said if you listened close, you could hear her crying at night, not for him, but for someone else. The children knew better. Thomas, barely 9, understood the language of silence. He saw the way his mother held the photograph of their father every evening like it might melt away in her hands. He saw her reach out in her sleep for someone who wasn't there. And sometimes, he saw her talking to herself, softly, as if the past could hear her and answer back. The little ones didn't understand, not really. Lily, at 5, knew only that the other girls wouldn't play with her. May, just a toddler, was too young to know the difference between a mother's love and a town's disdain. Their home was full of things that didn't speak: books, stitched blankets, wooden dolls. Evelyn made what she could with what she had, and that never included kindness from others. The schoolteacher nodded when she passed. The grocer handed her things without words. Even the preacher, who was supposed to be God's mouthpiece, offered only a stiff nod and a closed door. It was a lonely life, one filled with small hands to hold, but no hand to hold her own. One morning, after walking 5 miles to get flour and soap, she passed by a group of women gathered outside the post office. They fell quiet when she neared. One of them, a red-haired woman with too many rings and too much perfume, didn't even bother to lower her voice before muttering, "She still thinks she belongs here." Evelyn didn't flinch. She had grown used to being a ghost in her own town. But Thomas, walking beside her, clenched his little fists. He turned to say something, anything, but his mother gently touched his arm and shook her head. The lesson was always the same. Don't fight shadows. They'll only darken your path. At home, Evelyn would press her forehead to the wood of the front door after closing it, as though the house itself was the only one who understood her pain. And maybe it was. The floorboards creaked like old friends. The walls didn't judge. The windows welcomed the sun even when the people outside didn't. This was her world. A quiet prison, painted in muted tones and framed by the laughter she heard, but was never part of. She had grown used to the silence even when it hurt. She wore it like a shawl, tight around her shoulders, heavy with memory. But even in this silence, something stirred. Because across the forest, beyond the ridge and past the twisted pine, there was someone else just as alone. A man with calloused hands and a heart buried beneath layers of solitude. A woodsman, whom no one spoke of much because he never came into town. Some said he preferred trees to people. Others believed he'd once been part of a war that stripped the words from his soul. She didn't know about him yet, and he didn't know she existed, but fate was already stitching their stories together, thread by thread, silence by silence. Before we dive further into the story, just a quick note. I'm Thomas, the voice behind this narration. If you enjoy how it sounds, let me know in the comments so we can keep the same voice in future videos. Now, let's follow the road that led Evelyn out of Dry Creek and into the heart of the woods. The wind changed the day Evelyn ventured into the northern woods. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than a shortcut, a desperate attempt to save time and avoid the stairs from the main road. She had tied Lily's boots wrong that morning, and May had spilled the last of the milk. Everything felt heavy. So, with Thomas in tow and her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders, Evelyn cut through the timberline, choosing the long-forgotten path once used by hunters and fur traders. She didn't know she was being watched, not with malice, not with curiosity even. Just watched, observed, like the way one might watch the sunrise through frost-laced glass. Distant, beautiful, untouchable. He saw her before she saw him, standing at the edge of a clearing, where tall birch trees formed a cathedral of silver and white. She looked so out of place in her threadbare blue coat and laced-up boots that had seen too many winters. The children clung to her sides like ducklings. She carried a sack of potatoes in one arm and a small axe in the other, not for protection, just for chopping kindling, but it looked like a weapon in her grip. He didn't mean to make a sound, but dry leaves crack under worn boots, and in the woods, every sound is a confession. She turned quickly, pulling Thomas behind her. Her eyes, wide and sharp as glass, met his. The stranger was tall, broad-shouldered with a thick coat of brown wool and a rough beard that had swallowed most of his face. He wore no expression, just watched. His hands were gloved, his stance still. Evelyn waited for words. There were none. She gave a single nod, protective but polite, and began to walk again, gripping Thomas's hand more tightly. But the man's voice, when it came, was deep and slow like a river in early spring. You're on the ridge path. She stopped, turned halfway. I know. Not many take it. Not safe in winter. She looked toward the heavy sky. Snow was coming. You could smell it. She didn't answer. You live down in Dry Creek, he added, more statement than question. She nodded again. He didn't smile, didn't frown, just looked at her for a long moment, long enough for her to feel seen in a way she hadn't in years. Then with a slight tilt of his head toward the forest, he said, This way's quicker. I'll walk you to the edge. She hesitated, long enough for Thomas to look up at her, silently asking, Is it okay? She finally gave a quiet, All right. They didn't talk much after that. The woods around them filled the silence. Wind threaded through branches. Snow creaked on pine boughs. A hawk circled above. The man walked a few paces ahead, sometimes pausing to let her catch up. He moved like someone who didn't belong anywhere near people, but knew the trees like old friends. At the forest's edge, he stopped and pointed toward the slope that would take her down into town. Follow the creek, less ice. She turned to thank him, but the words caught in her throat. She hadn't thanked anyone in so long, she wasn't sure how it should sound. I'm Evelyn, she offered instead. He looked at her for a beat, then gave a small nod. Micah. And then he disappeared back into the woods, swallowed by branches and mist. She didn't tell anyone about the man in the forest. Not that anyone would have listened. But something about the way he spoke, plain with no expectation, had stayed with her. Over the next few weeks, the forest called to her more often. Not for him. Not at first. But for the quiet. The kind of silence that didn't judge. The children came with her sometimes, gathering pine cones and small twigs. She would sit on a fallen log, let the breeze brush her cheek, and remember that there was a world beyond Dry Creek's cruel eyes. And sometimes, Micah was there, never waiting, never asking, but always appearing like the forest itself had decided they should meet. They spoke in glances mostly, a nod, a lifted hand, sometimes a word. Storm coming. Creeks iced over. You walked too close to the ridge. Little by little, she learned things about him. He lived alone in a cabin deep beyond the ridge, off a path so narrow even deer avoided it. He hunted, chopped wood, and carved tools by hand. He didn't ask about her life, but he listened when she spoke, even if she only said 2 words at a time. Once, when May had gotten too cold, Evelyn had bundled her against her chest, panic rising with every shiver of the child's lips. Micah had arrived like a ghost and handed her a wool blanket so warm it steamed in the air. Made from bear fur, he said. Take it. She tried to refuse, but he only looked at her, unblinking. Children shouldn't freeze, and just like that, he was gone again. The town noticed. Dry Creek always noticed. Whispers began to stir when Evelyn started walking through the north edge of town, basket in hand, shawl tighter, eyes brighter. She was changing, nothing dramatic but enough to be seen. She's seen someone, muttered a shopkeeper. Probably one of those drifters, someone else said. And when Thomas, who had never been one to lie, mentioned a man in the woods, while playing with another boy, the whispers turned sharp. The preacher made a vague sermon about keeping company with shadows. The women gave colder looks, and Evelyn felt it, heavy on her back like a stone she didn't ask to carry. She didn't care. Not entirely. Not the way she used to. Because one morning, just as the snow had begun to melt and the air held the faintest hint of spring, Micah handed her a small carved bird. It was simple, rough, uneven, but somehow delicate. A lark. The same kind Thomas had once drawn in the dust on their floor. Why? She asked, holding it in her palm like something fragile. Micah shrugged. He mentioned it once. Your boy, she looked at him then. Truly looked, and said softly, You remember everything, don't you? His eyes flicked away. Only the things that matter. That night she sat by the fire, the bird in her hand. Her heart quieter than it had been in years, but peace doesn't come easy, not in a place like Dry Creek. One evening, as she walked home from town, she noticed footprints behind her. Not Micah's. These were deeper, angry, too close. She didn't turn around, just kept walking, faster. The next day, someone painted a red mark on her door, and that night, Thomas asked, Are we in trouble, Mama? She didn't answer. She just held him close and whispered, No one's going to hurt you. But she wasn't sure she could promise that anymore. The wind outside howled through the trees, and somewhere deep in the woods, Micah stood outside, his cabin, staring into the blackness, because he too had felt the shift. Something was coming. The snow came harder that week, thick and wet and cruel. It swallowed the roads and froze the wells, blanketing Dry Creek in a silence that no church, bell or gossip could cut through. Evelyn kept her head down. She spoke only when she had to, wrapped the children tight in what coats they had, and rationed the root cellar like it was the last thing tethering them to survival. She didn't go into town unless she had to. Not after the mark on her door. Not after the murmurs at the market turned into spit in her path and a broken egg tossed at her feet. She tried not to let it reach the children, but it did. Lily came home crying one afternoon, her hands scraped, her braid pulled loose. A boy had pushed her into the dirt, calling her a witch's daughter. Evelyn had knelt down, wiping the mud from Lily's knees, but her hands trembled with the effort to stay calm. Thomas looked away. He knew better than to cry anymore. Later that night, Evelyn stared at the cracked teapot on the stove, listening to the water not quite boil. The bird Micah had carved still sat on the mantel. She turned it over in her hand, her thumb brushing the grain of the wood. It had become a comfort and a warning. The more he meant to her, the more the town hated her for it, and she had started to mean something to him too. She could see it in the way he lingered just a little longer on the edge of the forest, in the way he noticed when she limped more than usual, in the rare warmth behind his eyes when May offered him a drawing made of coal dust and paper scraps. But that same week, something snapped. It began with a knock. Late. Harsh. Two shadows at the door, their breath puffing white in the cold. One was the preacher, the other Sheriff Langley. She knew before they even spoke that this wouldn't be kind. "There's been talk," the preacher said, his voice smug under its cloak of holiness. Langley didn't look at her. "We've had complaints about your behavior, about the man seen around your property, the children, the influence." The word tasted like poison. She tried to speak, to explain, but the preacher raised his hand like a judge. "It's not just whispers anymore, Evelyn. The town's decided it's time to intervene." Before she could even ask what that meant, Langley stepped forward and pulled a folded paper from his coat. "You'll come with us. Temporarily. Just until things settle," Thomas screamed. May clung to her leg. Lily tried to block the door, all 12 years of her fury on display. Evelyn held her ground. "You have no right." "It's protective custody," Langley said flatly. But when she stepped back inside, to grab her shawl, to think, to run, that's when the third man came around the back. She didn't even see him until his hand was on her arm, yanking her hard, slamming the door shut behind her as her children screamed from inside. Everything after that was a blur of snow and breath and falling. They pushed her into the preacher's wagon. She fought, like an animal, like a mother, but she was small, and the storm was loud, and the woods were far. The wagon rattled away from the cottage with only one lantern swinging from the back. She didn't know how long they rode. When they stopped, it wasn't in town. It was the old barn behind the church, where animals were once kept before the last war. No locks. No cells. Just four walls and judgment. Langley gave her a flask of water. "It's just for the night. You need to cool off. Let the town cool off too." Then he left her there, in the straw, alone. She sat, stunned, not angry, not crying, just hollow, as if something inside had been cracked open and drained out. Snow blew in through the gaps in the wood. Her fingers went numb. Her legs ached. Her limp had worsened that week, and now every nerve screamed for rest. She curled in a corner facing the wall. The bird was still in her pocket. She gripped it like a prayer. At some point her mind gave out, and sleep took her. She didn't hear him arrive. Didn't hear the door creak or the snow crunch. It was the warmth that woke her first. A hand on her shoulder, not shaking, just there. Steady. Present. Micah. She blinked into the darkness, confusion giving way to disbelief. "How?" "I followed the wagon," he said, crouching beside her. "Waited till they left." His coat smelled of pine and smoke. His hands were raw from the cold, but still he offered her his gloves. "They took me," she whispered. "They think I'm unfit." He didn't speak. Didn't rush to deny it or promise false safety. He just pulled his own blanket from his pack and wrapped it around her. "I can't fight them," she said, voice cracking. "I tried, and now the kids—" She broke off. Micah's voice was low. "They're safe. I saw them before I came. They're scared, but safe. She let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. I should run, she said. Go far. Disappear. You could, he said. She looked at him, surprised. You won't stop me? His eyes met hers. No, but I won't let you go alone. Tears, threatened. But not the kind that came from despair. The kind that came from being seen and not judged. Micah didn't touch her, didn't lean in or hold her. He just sat there across from her in the straw, letting her choose silence or speech. I'm not strong enough, she whispered. You are, he said, but even strong people get tired. She closed her eyes. Will you walk me home? She asked. He nodded, and together, just before dawn broke across the hills, they stepped out into the snow, not as savior and saved, but as two quiet warriors, side by side. Winter thawed, but it didn't leave quietly. The storms clawed at the valley one last time in late March, snow turning to rain, rain to mud, and the wind biting like old grudges. The day Micah and Evelyn returned to the cottage, the front door hung half off its hinges. The townsfolk hadn't burned it down like she'd feared, but they had looted what they pleased. Her pantry was half empty. The woodpile was gone. A Bible had been ripped apart and left on the floor, pages soaked with snowmelt, but the hearth was still there. So was the carved bird on the mantel. So was she. So was he. Evelyn knelt down and picked up the scattered pages of the Bible, not to save the scripture, but because no one should get to decide what's sacred for her anymore. Micah didn't say anything. He just set to work right beside her, replacing the door, starting a fire, nailing boards across broken windows. By sunset, the cottage looked wounded, but not defeated. Like her. They didn't talk much about the night in the barn, not because they were avoiding it, but because something had shifted. Something unspoken. Firm. He was no longer the woodsman, just passing through, and she was no longer the woman who flinched at footsteps. They started building, one day at a time. He taught the children how to mend the chicken coop, how to spot rabbit tracks in the snowmelt, how to sharpen a knife without slicing their thumbs. Evelyn taught him how to make onion soup from nothing, how to read the baby's fever before it took hold, how to fold laundry one-handed while bouncing a toddler on the hip. He moved into the shed out back, at first, but Thomas would sneak out to sit by his fire. Then May started falling asleep in his lap. Then Lily left a pair of her shoes outside the door. In case you don't want to muddy the kitchen, Mr. Micah. By spring, his boots were by the front door. They planted together. Not just seeds, dreams. One morning, Evelyn said aloud what had only existed in her mind. What if we made it more than a cabin? Micah looked up from the fence post he was driving. What do you mean? A ranch. For travelers, widows, lost ones. Somewhere people could rest. He paused, wiped his brow. That's no small idea. She smiled. It's not a small world. He didn't answer. Just nodded once, slow and certain. So they built it. Not all at once. Piece by piece, a second barn from scavenged beams, a roof patched with care, a field tilled with blistered hands and hope. The first horse came in May, a half-wild mare someone traded for 3 hens and a basket of cloth. Evelyn named her Grace, but peace never comes without a price. The town hadn't forgotten. Neither had the preacher. The sheriff hadn't been seen since spring began, but that only made the whispers worse. You heard she's playing house now with the woodsman? She took him in just like she trapped her husband. She's turning the kids into wild things. One night Micah returned from a trip into town, jaw tight. What happened? Evelyn asked, wiping her hands on a towel. He hesitated, then placed something on the table. It was a flyer. Wanted. Micah Rourke, deserter. Suspected horse theft. Last seen near Kansas border. Evelyn stared at the paper. It's old, he said quietly. 5 years. Before the war ended. I ran when they ordered us to burn a farm full of women and children. I couldn't do it. I stole a horse and disappeared into the mountains. Figured if I kept moving, they'd stop looking. She touched the edge of the flyer. It trembled beneath her fingertips. You lied, she said, voice steady but low. I never said I was clean, he replied. Only that I was trying to live quiet. She looked at him. The man who had patched her roof, taught her son to fish, who had sat beside her in silence when her knees gave out, and she thought she'd break all over again. That paper doesn't scare me, she finally said. But if the law comes for you, I need to know. Will you run again? Micah looked down. Then slowly, deliberately, he shook his head. Not anymore. It wasn't long before the law did come. 2 riders, one uniformed, one cloaked in the same gray coat she remembered from that awful night. Sheriff Langley. They came at dusk. Micah met them outside the fence. Evelyn followed. The sheriff looked smug. The younger deputy held the wanted flyer like scripture. Langley sneered. You think we wouldn't find out? The whole town's been whispering about the outlaw playing family in the hills. Micah didn't flinch. That flyer's 5 years stale. Langley raised a brow. Still official. Still actionable. Evelyn stepped forward. And what about kidnapping a woman in the middle of the night? What about dragging her from her home on the word of a preacher and a few jealous tongues? Langley's smile thinned. Careful, miss. You're already on thin ice. No, she said. You are. Her voice was calm, clear. The fire was back. Not the kind that destroys, but the kind that lights lamps in the dark. We have land now, she said. A deed, signed and sealed. You come onto it without a warrant. That's trespassing. Langley's eyes narrowed. Micah placed a hand on her back, gently guiding her behind him. Let them try, he murmured. They didn't take Micah that night. The deputy, young and nervous, looked unsure, muttered something about needing to check jurisdiction. Langley rode off with a curse under his breath and eyes full of poison, but it wasn't. Over. They both knew it. That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. She stood by the fire, arms wrapped around herself, watching the flames flicker. Micah joined her, quietly. If they come back? She asked. I won't leave you, he said. She looked up at him. The fear was still there, but it no longer owned her. I know. They kissed for the first time, not like a dream, but like an anchor. Steady. Earned. It wasn't passion. That moved them. It was the knowledge of all they had built together, and what still needed protecting. The fire returned, not just in the hearth, but in her voice, her steps, her spine, and in him too. Not as a man who fled the past, but as one ready to face it, for the family he never expected. Together, they were no longer running from anything. They were standing for something, and that made all the difference. The letter came in April, stamped, sealed, and colder than any snow they'd survived. Micah opened it with stiff fingers. His eyes scanned the page once, twice, before he handed it silently to Evelyn, an official summons. Micah Rourke, to stand trial in Cedar Hollow. Charge, desertion and theft of government property. A date, a time, a place. They were done whispering. Evelyn folded the paper slowly. Her hands didn't shake. Micah looked at her. I'll go, she said nothing. I won't let them drag you or the children into it, he added. She still said nothing. Then finally, softly, and if they hang you? His silence was louder than the wind outside. The day came. They rode into Cedar Hollow at dawn, side by side. Evelyn wore her only good dress, the same one she'd worn at her wedding, altered now with stronger thread and a new lace collar. Micah wore his cleanest shirt, but he didn't try to hide the old scars across his knuckles or the line of gray in his beard. The townspeople gathered like crows, whispering. There had never been a proper trial here, just decisions handed down by those with power and pulpits. Sheriff Langley stood on the steps of the old courthouse, arms folded. Micah stepped forward, but before he could speak, Evelyn did. I have something to say, she called out, clear and strong. Langley frowned. This isn't your trial, widow. No, she said, but it's my life too. And she climbed the steps. The crowd stilled. She looked out across faces that had judged her for years, for loving the wrong man, for mourning too long, for surviving what others said she caused. "I have been called many things by this town," she began. "A curse, a burden, a widow who should have just disappeared." Her voice didn't waver. "But this man," she turned to Micah, "he didn't just walk into my life. He stayed. When it was ugly, when it was cold, when it was dangerous." She faced the people again. "You call him a deserter, but he deserted cruelty. He chose mercy." She stepped closer to Langley. "You want a trial? Try me. Try a woman who dared to start again, who dared to love again." Langley's jaw twitched. "You always did have a mouth on you, and you always had a rope in your hand," she said, quiet and sharp. The wind hushed. Micah stepped forward now, standing beside her. "I'll go to trial," he said, "but not in this town, not under your law." He looked at the faces before him. "If I am to be judged, let it be by those who know the cost of war, of peace, of rebuilding what's been broken." Langley stared at him, then at Evelyn. He spat on the ground. "You two don't belong here," she smiled. "We know." They left that afternoon, not as exiles, but as people who had outgrown the prison of small minds. The children rode in the back of the wagon, holding the reins of a second horse they'd traded for the week prior. Lily leaned her head on Thomas's shoulder. May cradled a rag doll Micah had carved for her on a long winter night. Evelyn looked over at him as they passed the outskirts of town. "You sure?" she asked. He nodded. "We'll find a place. Might take time, but we'll make it ours." She reached out and took his hand. "I don't want to hide anymore," she said. "We won't." 2 months later, beneath the glow of a starlit sky, Evelyn stood barefoot on soft earth and held Micah's hands as the children gathered wildflowers in a ring around them. There was no preacher, no papers, just the wind, the fire, and a vow whispered. Between two people who had known too much silence to waste words now, Micah leaned down to kiss her forehead. "We built something," she murmured. "We'll keep building." Their new land was small, but fertile. The house wasn't finished, but the roof didn't leak, and the walls were sturdy. They called it Second Light. Not for what they'd lost, but for what came after. The baby was born on the first frost of autumn, small, strong-lunged, and wrapped in Evelyn's old shawl. They named him Jonas, after the woodsman who once brought them eggs when no one else would. Micah carved a cradle. The children took turns singing lullabies. Evelyn rocked him under the stars, whispering stories of wild mares and broken towns, and the night she almost didn't survive, and the man who chose her anyway, not to save her, but to stand with her. And now, she still has a scar on her cheek. She still walks with a slight limp on cold mornings. But she laughs louder now, and sometimes, when the firelight is just right, and the baby is sleeping, and Micah is sitting beside her with his calloused fingers, laced with hers, she closes her eyes and knows. This was never a curse. It was a beginning.